Hey guys, Zen here, and we have now reached our second anniversary of both Jager and Bandit losing the ACOG scope in Rainbow Six Siege. Now, I think it's a really interesting topic to discuss at this point in particular, because here in Year 4 Season 3, with Operation Ember right over the horizon here, there's going to be a resurgence in the ACOG with this season, and also a lot of the rules have changed around the scope, and so today I want to talk about that. And also, well, it's an anniversary. There's a bit of a celebration. So let's get into this, guys. Now, I actually want to start this conversation off with Kaid, my main, surprisingly enough, and it's because as of now, he's actually the only defender that has an ACOG scope on a secondary weapon, being the .44 mag. Now, it isn't the traditional ACOG scope, nor is it the Russian ACOG scope. It is particular to the .44 mag, but it does still offer the same magnification as a traditional ACOG scope in the meta. So the reason this is important now is because it wasn't always this way. For those of you who don't know, the SMG-11 used to have an ACOG scope available for it, and it gave operators like Smoke, who didn't really have an answer for long range, that ability to still be lethal at long range with that scope attached to their secondary. Now, over the course of time, it became pretty apparent that a secondary weapon with an ACOG scope was just too strong, especially one that was as powerful as the SMG-11, given the fact it has some of the highest DPS in the game, and also the fact that it really is just a headshot machine. Pair that with an ACOG scope, and it was just a little too overwhelming for the meta. So of course, Ubisoft removed it from that secondary. Alright then, well, what does this all mean then, Zen? Why the history lesson on the ACOG scope? Well, guys, the rules have changed. Now, no, the .44 mag isn't an automatic secondary option, nor is it nearly as powerful as the SMG-11, but it isn't excluded from having an ACOG scope, which means that in the future, there could be more secondary options with an ACOG scope. And as we all know, here with Operation Ember Rise, Goyo, being a 2-speed 2-armor operator, has access to an ACOG scope on the TCSG, which changes the rules pretty much across the board for defense and who is able to have ACOG scopes equipped on their primary weapons. Now, over the course of the last 2 years, where all of these changes have occurred, and since Jager and Bandit have lost the ACOG scope on their primary weapons, there's been a blanket rule across defense that only 3 armor operators will have access to the ACOG scope moving forward, and anything under that will not be able to use one. This season breaks that rule. Again, Goyo is a 2-speed 2-armor defender that with the TCSG has access to an ACOG scope on a primary weapon. Now, I've said this in the past, and just being honest with you guys, I've never been a big fan of the rule that only 3 armor operators have access to the optic. The fact is that it hasn't been super consistent throughout the game either. If we look back even before this season, we had both Mira and Tachanka, 2 3-armor operators that don't have access to the ACOG. Now, with Mira, it makes a lot of sense. The Vector is an incredible weapon and also kind of resembles the SMG-11 in some ways as far as fire rate and headshot potential, and so that weapon not having access to the ACOG scope does make a lot of sense. There's also a lot of synergy there with her Miras and being able to lock down long sight lines, and so as far as the Vector is concerned, I don't think that it should really ever have access to an ACOG scope, whether that's Mira, whether that's Goyo, or any future operator for that matter. The Vector is just too strong of a weapon by itself to have access to the ACOG. Now, when you look over at Tachanka, he's one of, if not the most underwhelming operator on defense. I think his loadout could definitely benefit from having an ACOG scope. Just being honest with you guys, I think everyone has some idea of how Tachanka could be buffed or changed or improved and reworked so that he's an actually viable pick, and everybody has a theory, but for me personally, it's always been just as simple as giving him an ACOG scope, not just on his main submachine gun, but also on his turret. Tachanka has absolutely no sights on his main gadget, and I think it hurts him a lot more than some realize, and so even if it was temporary, or even if it was just a small part of the rework, I think giving his turret an option to have some sort of scope, and preferably an ACOG scope, would give it a little bit more long distance and a little bit more viability in the meta today, versus the ACOGs against the attackers. Now, of course, there is a full-blown rework to Tachanka coming at some point, possibly even sooner than later, if small leaks are to be believed, but I think if there's ever been an operator that could benefit from that blanket rule of only 3 armors having access to the ACOG scope, it is Tachanka. Now, of course, there is one other operator that's released recently that doesn't have access to an ACOG on defense, and that is, of course, Warden, probably one of the most controversial topics of Year 4. Warden doesn't have access to an ACOG scope, and he is also a 3 armored defender. But I think the reason that he doesn't is the same reason that Tachanka doesn't, and it's because both of their primary SMGs are available on 2-speed 2 armor operators, Valk and Kapkan. So what does this all mean, and why is it relevant now to Jager and Bandit losing their ACOG scope? Well, at least for me, it means that these blanket rules that are washed over the game don't really exist anymore, and I think that the balance of who gets to use the ACOG comes down to the operator balance and everything they bring in their kit individually. This also means that I wouldn't completely rule out the possibility of even 3 speeds on defense having access to ACOGs if the specific operator makes sense in having it. But that will of course bring us to Jager and Bandit and why they actually had their ACOGs removed, and if it's ever possible that we'll see them with them again. Now, just being honest, no, I don't think Jager or Bandit will ever see an ACOG scope again, and it's for many reasons. With both of them, it starts with the fact that they're 3-speed operators, so they're very agile, they're very fast, and of course able to get around the map very quickly. There's also the fact of their weapons, and this is kind of where the Kaid and .44 mag reference comes from, but both the 416 and the MP7 are absolutely legendary and very powerful weapons, and really just don't require an ACOG scope to be that good. And so without a doubt, this is definitely one of the bigger reasons why they don't have access to that scope on those weapons. And the final reason I think was more of a time period issue. At the time when they actually did have the ACOG scopes, the spawn peaking with these operators was absolutely ridiculous. Again, at the time, they were the only 3-speed operators with access to an ACOG scope, and so it was very easy for them to leave the objective, go for a spawn peak, and get back to the objective very easily and very safely because of how fast they could get around the map. It's essentially all of these reasons why these two lost the attachment, and probably why we'll never see them have it again. Now, looking forward, I think with future 3-speed operators, there shouldn't be a blanket rule that states that they're just completely exiled from having any form of an ACOG scope. Again, when you look at Kaid's .44 mag, if that weapon didn't have an ACOG scope, for instance, it definitely wouldn't have the same impact that it does today. And boy, just how satisfying it is to get a headshot with that weapon in particular. If, for instance, a 3-speed operator were to launch with no automatic options and a primary that was a DMR of some kind, then yes, I feel like it would be totally okay for that operator to have access to an ACOG scope. But to close it out here, guys, I'll say that the rules have definitely changed. With Operation Ember Rise, we're seeing a direct impact of this with Goyo, a 2-speed 2 armor operator, having access to an ACOG scope. Now, that ACOG scope isn't on an MP5, it isn't on an MP7, it isn't on a 416, but it is on a primary weapon nonetheless, which means that there is the potential for more operators to launch in the future with access to an ACOG scope without being a 3 armor operator, which is honestly really exciting. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that there aren't some operators currently in the game that could really use an ACOG scope to buff up their loadouts, like Warden specifically. Basically, since his release in Operation Phantom Sight here, the community have been begging for him to have access to the P90, and who knows, maybe that is a buff coming sometime in the future, because at this time, there's just no way to give him an ACOG on the MPX without literally buffing up Valkyrie in the exact same way, and that's just something that really isn't necessary for that operator at this time. As far as Tachanka, I know that there's a full rework coming, but again, I think giving him and his gadget access to an ACOG scope would really buff him up, and surprisingly enough, it could make that gadget quite viable in the meta. Now, I mentioned this at the 1-year anniversary, but no, again, I don't think that Jager or Bandit will ever see an ACOG scope again, but on top of that, I just don't think it's necessary at all for them. Since they removed it, Bandit and Jager have remained top tier operators, with Jager in particular being the #1 defender in the game by a huge margin. Now, for year 4 season 4, there's supposedly a defender bringing competition to Jager by dealing with attacker nades, and it'll be interesting to see how this op compares to Jager and whether or not they'll have an ACOG equipped. So guys, that's it. It's the anniversary of one of the biggest changes that was ever made to Rainbow Six Siege, and in the 2 years since, that's everything surrounding the topic. But of course, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Jager and Bandit should get the ACOG back? And also, do you think more operators like Goyo, who aren't 3 armor, should have access to it as well? Leave everything in a comment down below. But gentlemen, this is a celebration, right? So who better to enjoy the event with than the Rainbow Boys themselves? They've got a message for those of us who are still salty years later, so I hope you enjoy. It's been Zen. Hey, I'm out.